Hello, and welcome again to our looking at the upcoming scriptures. This week, the first reading is from the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. From the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 10, verses 11 through 14, and then verses 18. And then from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, verses 24 through 32. We have been following, as you know, during the course of this year, for every regular Sunday, the Gospel according to Mark, and this weekend brings us to the end of the Markan year. This will be the last time that we will have a Gospel passage from Mark. And it also brings us to chapter 13. Now, chapter 13 is an interesting addition or chapter, if you want, to Mark's story. Sometimes known, and there's much discussion that goes on about this in current times, as the apocalyptic section. Apocalyptic, basically, of course, is a style of writing that tends to present things in a rather colorful, dramatic, and at times exaggerated way, with the purpose, of course, both of entertaining, but of teaching and getting one's attention. The most familiar book of Apocalypse in the New Testament is the last book, the book of Revelation, and we have talked about that earlier in the year when sections from Revelation were used during the Easter season, for the first reading. Now, what apocalypse, or the eschatological section, generally has to do with looking to the future, to things that are to come. Now, chapter 13 is, in fact, a rather long discourse of Jesus in which he is talking about things that his disciples in the future will be facing. Keep in mind that throughout much of this gospel, the message of Jesus seems to have been directed toward the disciples, getting them ready both for the mission of the kingdom, but now there is a hint that he will not be with them so much longer, and that therefore they must carry out the mission. The most difficult part of this gospel, the 13th chapter, is in fact interpretation, because in some ways it is directed not simply to the disciples, but also to the audience. Keep in mind, and I may have mentioned this way back when we started with the Gospel of Mark, that it was probably a work that was intended to be read to the community. After all, it's not a gospel, and most of the New Testament was never really read by people, but was proclaimed by a speaker, by someone who gave it. And in this sense, Mark's gospel very nicely plays out to a kind of soliloquy kind of approach of presenting the gospel. But in certain places where the narration stops, the message goes to those who are listening or to the audience. So that's part of apocalyptic teaching. Apocalyptic thinking looks at the present and, as I mentioned, considers the future. Apocalyptic literature has its own style, as I mentioned, and often is the language and the concerns of the dispossessed, of those who are the oppressed, those who don't have a public voice. And so in a way, this kind of literature gives them an opportunity to express their needs and to express their hopes. But besides the fact that this is therefore generally, and as I've mentioned, I try to give you different viewpoints here, and this is the way I think in which it will be presented when we hear homilies coming this weekend. But it could also be, and this was another popular form, that famous people did, namely to give what we would call a farewell address, a last will and testament, giving to the folks who have followed with you some encouragement about where they have been, where we have been, but the famous person would say, but also where I hope that you will continue when I am gone. So part of this is important as a kind of background for appreciating the style of writing, the style of expression that this chapter of Mark's Gospel uses. Now, not all of the chapter are we going to hear. As you remember, I said we're going to pick it up at verses 24 through 32, but how does it begin? Well, it begins, one remembers that in the previous weeks that we have seen Jesus teaching in the temple area. Last week we saw that he observed the widow putting the small coins into the treasury box. And Jesus had previously to that been teaching, now leaves. And he leaves the temple, unfortunately, if you think about it, as the rejected, commissioned agent of the Son of God. The leadership has not accepted him, as you remember, has challenged him. And Jesus, of course, has condemned the Jerusalem leadership as not doing what they should be doing, and we've seen occasions over the last few weeks in studying the gospel where this is the case. He goes now via the Mount of Olives, and that is important to notice because earlier on, when the Babylonians had taken over the city of Jerusalem in the year 587 before the common time, many of the exiles from Jerusalem had taken the same route. They had gone through the Mount of Olives and then, of course, been led into exile for many years by the Babylonian military power. So this is now a similar departure. Some say when the city of Jerusalem in the year 70 was destroyed, that those who were able to escape took the same route through the Mount of Olives and down into the hinterland. So there's a kind of history connected with where Jesus is with 4 now of his disciples. 3, of course, are the very famous Peter, James, and John. But Andrew, and now when we add Andrew, remember that these were the first 4 who had been called by Jesus at the Sea of Galilee. So there's a conclusionness to chapter 13, by the way. 14, 15, and 16 narrate the passion and death and resurrection of Jesus, and that stands as a separate story of the gospel which we have looked at before. Now, what is happening here is there seems to be concern, and here we're not sure, and this is where the debate whether or not the city of Jerusalem was still standing, certainly it was still standing in Jesus' time, but whether it was still standing in the time of Mark. Some argue that the gospel was written shortly after the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70. Some say that it was shortly before, with an anticipation that things were not going too well in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, after all, had been showing revolution against Rome beginning in the year 65, when a group known as the Zealots had taken over Jerusalem and started a conflict against the Roman army, and that went on for, as we know, 5 years on and off. It was not a constant battle. And for a few years, the Zealots actually ruled the city. And during that time, we also believe that some believers in Jesus left the city at that time because they did not like what the Zealots were advocating and suggesting. So what now we get is apocalyptic thinking. Now this part will not be heard this Sunday, where they talk about the fact that there will be wars, famines, deceiving figures, and earthquakes. So you're getting some now phenomena of the earth, of most of them are human created. So, deceiving figures. There will appear, and this is now where this future kind of sense is presented into the story, popular prophetic figures who will be charming in the sense that they say what they are doing is under divine inspiration. Or they will make reference to what they're doing, says Jesus, in my name. Or they will offer different teaching or different spirituality from what I have been teaching. Beware of those figures, beware of those people, Jesus is pictured as saying. So, deceiving figures, wars. Now, wars are, when you think about it, human creation. They are not something that God starts, they are something that humans start. But wars, what happens is that in order to finance a war, there are extra taxes. If there keep things going, supplies are co-opted for the army, for the soldiers. Farmers, often at this time, because they can't get supplies for things, lose their land, lose animals. So wars take on a terrible price for the ordinary person. That's why I said, remember, apocalyptic often looks at the ordinary person, the kind of suffering person. Wars also say that when you have troops, they rampage through villages, they burn houses, they rape women, they enslave citizens, they create undue injuries, and sometimes even death. So when war is predicted here, see that it is something which is engineered, unfortunately, by human beings. He also says that there will be famine. Now, famine, of course, could simply be because there's not enough water to keep the crops growing. But what happens, and we do know that in the early 40s and 50s in Palestine, there were some years in which there was little or no rain, and so therefore there would be poor harvests, but poor harvests just increased taxes. Because if you had bad weather, things didn't grow, this caused diseases, people got sick, lives were lost. If there was a harvest, then the government, Rome, would levy an extra tax on the harvest in order to kind of get it themselves. And there would be market manipulation. Sounds like modern times, the principle of law of supply and demand. So if you had low supply and high demand, prices went up. And all of this was the result when a famine is predicted. So in this section, Jesus is pictured as telling his disciples that this is going to happen. Now, as I say, Jesus says it's going to happen. By the time that Mark writes down Jesus' story, much of this has happened. So you see, got to be careful about this prediction and how one understands it and how this whole chapter here is at work. So the upshot of this somewhat is that things are going to get worse before the final goal is reached. What is the final goal? And we've seen this a number of times, and we'll continue to see this as we look at the New Testament. The expectation on the part of many that the coming of Jesus was going to be imminent. The glorious new reign of God, the new kingdom of the Father, was going to happen shortly. We'll come back to this point a little bit as we go along here. So Jesus now says to the disciples, you know, if these things happen to me, you might expect that they're going to happen to you. So if they opposed me because of the things I was teaching and doing, they are going to oppose you. And as often as you proclaim the good news, be willing to accept the fact that you might not be accepted. And if you challenge Rome in any way, in any form, in any style, don't be surprised that Rome will strike back. They're not going to take it without some resistance on your part. Then he says, some of you will be handed over to local councils and synagogues, the governor and to some of his puppet kings. Now, they predict this, but I think it's important to notice that there is really very little evidence that this ever really happened. After all, the group of Jews who believed in Jesus as the risen Messiah was relatively small when you looked at the larger picture of Judaism of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Historians, Catholic Christian historians rather, kind of like to dramatize how Christians put their lives on the block for the sake of the gospel. There may have been, and certainly there were on occasion, a few where this happened, but by and large, the presence of Christians in the world prior to the fall of Jerusalem as a believing community of Jews was considered by the Romans and even by Jews themselves as just another brand of Judaism. Christian historians like to kind of make, well, like the gospel spread, and some of those numbers are tremendous, like the loaves of bread that were present, 3,000, 4,000. But the number of those who accepted Jesus, and we'll see this, or you can see this when you go and look at Paul's letters. His communities of believers were relatively small in terms of numbers. Now, in terms of influence, well, that might be another question. The only place where there may have been some difficulties with regard to accepting the message of Jesus may well have been in households, namely when a daughter or a son accepted the way of Jesus and his teaching, and mom or dad said, wait a minute, no, that's not the way we taught you, that's not the way you should be doing it, and then there was a real tension between mother and daughter, or mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, and father and son. So that may be true, that Jesus here is pictured as saying that could happen, and in fact did happen. And the message here is hang on, don't give up. This is important to stay the course. Now, there is also a reference, this would be in verses 14 through 23. Again, these are not verses that we're hearing this week, that there was a desolating sacrilege going on. And many kind of want to know, what is this sacrilege that Israel and that the Christians should be concerned about? And it has to do with something that the Roman emperors were doing. The Emperor Gaius Caligula, in the year 40, had a statue of himself put into the Jerusalem temple. You've got to see that rubbed wrongly against most Jewish believers. And here was Rome imposing its principle. That would have been a desolating sacrilege. Of course, the destruction of the temple in the year 70 itself was a desolating sacrilege. The Roman general and future emperor Titus, in the year 70, had burned the city, although he later said, I didn't really mean to do that, but he did it, and had the temple destroyed. That, of course, would have been a desolating sacrilege. The occupation, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, of the Zealots between the year 65 through 70, but particularly they ran Jerusalem in these years 67, 68, were considered by most Jews as radicals, and they wanted little or nothing to do with them, yet they were the ones that brought the conflagration with Rome to a head. And finally, the appearance, now we don't know exactly who these might be, of what would be called antichrists. In other words, what I mentioned a few minutes ago, some who were teaching other than Jesus did and claiming that Jesus wasn't at all the Messiah. So all of that is, in those verses, Jesus is predicting is going to happen. So you can see how this is both an interesting history of what happens between the time of Jesus' ascension, resurrection, and ascension, and the fall of Jerusalem. And yet, And this is how this section concludes, and yet there is a future. It is not the end. It will continue. And the divine action of God will be with the followers who at times have to bear up with unbearable suffering, but nevertheless, God is present there. Finally, this brings us now to the section for this week, verses 24 through 27. Now here, Jesus is pictured as, again, the apocalyptic imagery here has to do with nature. The sun will be dark and the moon will not shine. Notice these are things that have to do with nature, over which in many ways humans have no control. And nevertheless, it is an encouragement to stay the course. There is a couple woes here. For example, woe to those who are pregnant and nursing. Pray that it won't happen in the winter. Day of tribulation won't be seen like this since the beginning of creation. And again, false prophets and false messiahs will arise. Stay alert. Do not worry. Do not give in. Do not give up hope. Jesus here is pictured, and this has reference to the book of Daniel, which we really won't have much time to get into today. But in the book of Daniel, in the section that we hear, it will say that there will come a great calamity. There's another whole story to that. But there will come one like the Son of Man riding on the clouds. And it's that idea that's first articulated in the book of Daniel that now Mark uses, that the Son of Man will come riding on the clouds. Now, who is the Son of Man? Well, we interpret that to be Jesus. Jesus doesn't say that's going to be him, but that's the way in which we see it. Cloud, as you know, tends to represent always God's presence. And who are those who will be gathered with the Son of Man as he rides on the clouds, but angels who will be given the task to gather those who have remained faithful from the four corners of the earth, or the four winds, south, west, east, north, etc. There's one other little imagery we'll hear in verse 28, that they're about the fig tree, they love this fig tree. Now you remember that there weren't a lot of trees in Israel. There were evergreen trees, but they never, they always stay the same all year long. But the fig tree did get blossoms in the fall, in the spring, as we noticed, and then in good time flowered, and finally the fruit of the fig tree was also produced. The point that is made here is that the coming of Jesus in glory is close at hand. Now this, of course, is many are concerned about, and I go back to what we mentioned earlier today, that this sense that the coming of Jesus in glory was imminent, was very present throughout certainly the first part of the first century and well into it. Toward the time, as we will see later on, later writers like John are not so sure when this second coming, or this coming again of Jesus in glory, is going to be taking place. There is a caution here where Jesus says it will happen, but nobody knows, and even I don't know. Now that, of course, is an interesting phrase here, and some say, what do you mean Jesus doesn't know? Doesn't he know everything? Well, this certainly reflects the humanity of Jesus, but also the fact that whatever happens is the will of the Father, it's the will of God, and not Jesus. Remember, there was another occasion when Jesus said, I don't know. Remember when the two boys, Jimmy and John, had asked that they might have a seat at the right and left hand? He said, I don't know about that, how that's going to work. So the fact that Jesus, in the course of Mark's story, and we've seen this throughout this year, is a very human picture of Jesus, and the fact that he doesn't have this super knowledge. Now I know, because Jesus is divine, and see, we need always keep a balance when we look at Jesus in the Gospels, that he is both, yes, the Son of God, but he is also the Son of man or humankind. And so therefore, he has those kind of characteristics and needs as we do. And so the bottom line here again of this particular episode, keeping in mind it's all done in colorful language, apocalyptic language. Is God going to destroy the earth? We talked about this, I think, earlier last time that we looked at sections like this from the Gospels. Why would God want to destroy all the trees, flowers, plants, animals when they hadn't done anything? Why? And wasn't God the author of creation, and didn't he make a very beautiful world? So the new kingdom has to do with who is running it, who are the rulers, who are the people who are part of this kingdom. And that's what will be a new kingdom, a new time. The destruction of the old way. Well, what's the old way? Run by corruption, greed, power, the kind of things that happily, of course, we don't see in our time, do we? That, of course, it's all changed. Think about that. And so the promise of the kingdom in that way still is yet to be fulfilled, and we believe that. Even at Mass, we will say in our Eucharistic acclamation, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. So we do keep that as a part of the story. And that, briefly, now there are some other little aspects of this chapter that we could look at. And in conclusion, let me say that, well, verses 33 and 37, which immediately precede or follow this, was the gospel that was used on the first Sunday of Advent of this liturgical year, which has one more week to go. Next week, Christ the King. But so it ends leaving out what was the beginning of last time, okay? And there's a little reference in that one where a man goes away, leaves his household, puts his servants in charge, orders the gatekeeper to keep watch. Remember, we talked about all this back at the first Sunday of Advent. And to watch for the coming of the Master, because we don't know when he would come, but the watchman's job in the tower is to sound the alarm. He's here, and all of us should be prepared. So as we come now to the end of Mark's story, keep in mind what a beautiful work it is. It was the first of the gospel writers. He's the source for the other two synoptic writers, Matthew and Luke, and in it he presents a story of Jesus as, yes, the Son of God, yes, the Son of Man, yes, the Messiah, yes, the one chosen by God to inaugurate the kingdom. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and accept the good news. And that good news, repent, of course, means turn toward it, and but know that it will happen. So there's a great deal of hope, actually, in the readings that we hear this week, and that is the fundamental purpose of apocalyptic thinking, is to render to those who might be suffering, might be not experiencing all of the good things in life, that nevertheless God is going to be not only coming in the future, but is also supporting and strengthening those in the present. Stay alert, stay ready, and let perhaps, like the fig tree which blossoms new in the spring, we're moving into winter here, but let the good things of the Lord, the good things in our lives, the good things given us like the fig tree, blossom, and it will come to fruition. It is that spirit of hope. It is that spirit of confidence. It is that spirit of how wonderful the kingdom of God is. And as Mark creates it, he says, this is the good news, the victory of Jesus over sin and death, the victory of Jesus in the resurrection, and he truly will, in times to come, in the future, be with us, Lord, forever, as he is, but in a new and wonderful way. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you next time.